right, so what I have on the board is a number line, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I just want you to know that if you go to the right on the number line, by the way, you should know most of this, but we're just going to talk about it. If you go to the right on the number line, that means you're going in the positive direction. So as you travel to the right on the number line, in other words, we're going to go from 0 to 1, 2, 3. That's the positive direction. Now you can go to the left on the number line, and that's the negative direction. The more you go to the left, the lower the value is. The more you go to the right, the greater the value is. Okay? So now if I go 2 units to the left, that would mean that x equals -2. If I go 2 units to the right, starting from 0, then that value means x equals 2. Does that make sense? You guys have that written down? So this is just a basic number line. Now, you should be writing this down too. Today we're going to talk about a thing called the absolute value. So as you're writing this down in your notebook, absolute value is just the distance from 0, sort of. I got a couple football players in here. What happens if you take a loss of 2 yards? It's -2. You go back. What happens if you gain a 5 yards? You go +5. This is kind of the same thing. I start off at 0. If I go 3 spaces to the right, that's like +3. If I go back 3 spaces, think of this as like I advanced 3 yards, or I took a loss of 3 yards. So going backwards is 3. Going forwards is +3. I'm sorry. Going backwards is -3. Going forwards is +3. But in both cases, the distance that I traveled is 3. In other words, if I start at 0, I go 1, 2, 3 spaces. Now, the negative sign just tells me which direction I went, but I only went 3 spaces. So these lines right here, we call these absolute value brackets. So if I were to say to you, what is the absolute value of -3, you would be saying, oh, you're 1, 2, 3 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of -3 is 3. It's like saying you took a loss of 3 yards. The loss is a word that refers to the negative or direction. Gain would be positive, but no matter whether you make a gain or a loss, the ball traveled 3 yards. Does that make sense? So the absolute value is one of the things we'll be talking about today. Does everybody have this written down? Okay. All right. So now let's do one more thing. And I'm going to write this down, so add this in your notes. The absolute value. So absolute value is the distance traveled, and I'm going to say units. How many units traveled regardless of direction. Okay, so absolute value is the total number of units regardless of whether we have a gain or a loss. Okay, we're almost done with our first example. I got to teach you a couple things before we get to the first example. So on this next slide, we're going to talk about opposites. So if I have a marker, and think of this in terms of football, there's your 20-yard line and their 20-yard line. Those are opposites. You're on opposite sides of the field. Okay? You're basically the same distance from the goal. Except on a number line, we're thinking about the same distance from zero. So in this particular case, if my opposite, let me give you an example. If I'm at -7, what's the opposite of -7? +7. If I'm at +2, what's the opposite of +2? -2. If I'm at smiley face, what's the opposite of positive smiley face? Negative smiley face. Does that make sense? -3 and 3 are opposites. That's important because as we move forward and learn algebra, we use opposites a lot. Okay? We're almost to example number 1. The first problem that we're doing. Okay? Does everybody have this written down? Okay. Can I move on to the next slide? All right. Oh, finally. So example number 1 wants us to evaluate a couple different problems. Okay? I should probably put a Post-it note up here. It doesn't really hide anything. Yeah, it doesn't really hide anything. So let me explain. I've written out all the work, but let me explain. It says we need to evaluate an expression when y equals -5. So our expression is -y. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the negative sign right here. And then wherever there's a y, I'm going to put in parentheses -5. So when I say -y, I'm really saying -5. What is the negative of a negative? A positive. When you multiply a negative by a negative, you get a positive. So the negative of y is 5. For our next example, they want us to evaluate the absolute value of y. So I write some equal signs, and then I draw the absolute value brackets, but wherever there was a y, I put in -5. What is the distance from 0 for -5 on the number line? It's just 5. There's no positive or negative, it's just 5. Now what they want us to do is they want us to take the absolute value of -y. So I'm going to draw my absolute value brackets. Those are the lines that are going straight up and down. They're vertical. And I'm going to put my negative sign because I have a negative sign here. And then wherever there was a y in parentheses, I'm going to put -5. This is where the y gets plugged in. What's the negative of a negative? +5. Now, how far is +5 away from 0? Still 5 units. A common mistake that people make when it comes to absolute value brackets, they think you're supposed to do the opposite of whatever's in the absolute value brackets. No, the answer is just always positive. Okay? Lastly, what if I got a negative sign outside of the absolute value brackets? Well, I write that down. And then inside the absolute value brackets, I substitute in -5 for y. So I've got the absolute value of y, but y really equals -5. So I'm taking the absolute value of -5. Well, the absolute value of -5 is 5, but this negative sign doesn't just go away. It remains. So what's negative 5? It's just negative 5. Okay? Any questions on that?